All right, Paul, take it away.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second to last, actually, the penultimate session of the Family Visit Summit for 2020. It's great to see some of our friendly faces from the FVU community out there this afternoon. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Greg McCann and Tom Epperson. Greg is from a leading family business consultancy in the States who I've known now probably for about 10 years. And Tom, I've recently been introduced to, who works with Greg on numerous things from Innerwell. So they are going to look into how we develop entrepreneurial mindsets within a family firm. So without further ado, guys, over to you. The audience out there, if you have any questions, either raise your hand, use the chat function or post a message, and we'll make sure we address any of the issues as we go through. So let's make it as interactive and value added as possible. But Greg, Tom, over to you.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Paul. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Again, just quick housekeeping. If you have questions, you have thoughts, feel free to drop it into the chat. We're going to have lots of conversation today. We're going to be sharing content with you, but we would love to make it more of a dialogue than just a straight download. Greg's really smart. I'm less so. So we'll try and answer your questions as you have them. So with that said, let's hope the technology works.
Good here, Tom.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk a little bit about family enterprise mindset as well as values-based leadership. And so our goal today is to share with you a little bit about how to develop a family enterprise mindset, what it is, what it looks like, to talk about values-based leadership and how to use that tool to create alignment within both the organization as well as the family. We want to help you identify how you can increase your own capacity as a leader and your agility to cope with various challenges that you're facing today, and then really discuss your questions. Greg?
Good. Yeah, you know, the world today, even before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has changed everything. So think about what airlines are going through, think about what hotels, tourism, restaurants, entire industries are being disrupted. You know, some are benefiting. The tech companies, alcohol and tobacco sales are way up. Online retailers, you know, Amazon, I think, is about to become the world's biggest everything. But I think one of the seeds we want to plant today is if you're in a family business, and we'll use the term family enterprise, the capacity to deal with change is going to become more important than ever. You know, my emails end with the slogan, "The age of casual family business is over." And so I think we want to keep returning to that theme. So next slide, if you would, Tom. Yeah, so if all this change is going on, and I want to give you a few stats to sort of validate this. 10 years ago, there was a major study done in the US across the country, across industry, family enterprises, second generation and older. And it found three stats that I think are just profound. It said 90% of family enterprises in the US own more than one business. 20% own 5 or more businesses. And that doesn't include a family office, a family foundation. So families are owning and operating more stuff. Okay, so this iconic version of we own one industry and it never changes and we pass it on forever is less true in the world than it ever has been. I think the other stat that just blew me away is the average family enterprise in that survey had changed their core business 2.1 times. That was 10 years ago. I would imagine it's trending upwards. And now with the pandemic, I'm guessing it might be 2.5 times. So if you and your family knew that you were going to change your core business 2.5 to 3 times in the coming years, are you ready for it? And here's the mindset that I think Tom and I preach. That's a subtle but profound shift. Family enterprise mindset says we're a family that deploys our finances, our talent, and our relationships into opportunities that align with our purpose, our reason for existing, our vision and values. And Tom's going to talk much more about the values. And if you adopt that, then I think it's inevitable that the family has to have ongoing practice to develop the family to be a strategic advantage. So things like trust, patient capital, long-term thinking. What are we doing to make sure we're bringing those and assessing those to everything we do? Good. Next, if you would, Tom.
So before and I'm going to take a risk again with the technology. So I don't know if everybody knows how to do this, but if you put your cursor over top of your own face, you'll see 3 dots. And if you click on those 3 dots, it'll give you a chance to rename yourself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So it'll give you a chance to rename yourself. So in that rename function, what I'd like you to do is to think about your own family business enterprise. And how strong of a mindset do you have? And so 0 would be, we're not aligned at all around our purpose. We're not aligned at all around our values. We really are just functioning a very transactional business. 10 would be, you're very tightly aligned between your purpose, your vision, your values with how you deploy resources, how you run the organization. And so if you would just rename yourself from 0 to 10, 0 being low, 10 being high, how you would rate your current family enterprise, what would you say?
Wow, that's great. Wow, great numbers.
So it looks like we're pretty on the high end between 8, 9, and 10. So we're going to be preaching to the choir today as we go through the rest of our content. So again, sorry. So if the why behind how we run our organizations is being aligned around our vision and our values and our purpose, our reason for being, and we've got tight alignment amongst our family members as well as the organization itself, then the what is values-based leadership. So values-based leadership at its core is about living, working, and leading in alignment with core values and helping to ignite the potential of other people to help them do the same thing. In other words, when we are more authentic, when we act in alignment with our values, we tend to perform better, we tend to be happier, we tend to gain more trust from others. Others tend to perceive us as authentic. And when we model that for other people, that allows them to do the same thing. And it can happen both in our enterprises and in our places of work, as well as in our families. And so we believe, Greg and I, that leadership is a choice, not a title. So it doesn't matter if you're the official head of the family or if you're the CEO or if you've got a great, corner office. What matters more is that you are acting in alignment. You're making the choice to act on your values. You're making the choice to make decisions that align with your organization's purpose. And I think what COVID has done for most of our clients is given them the opportunity to really act in alignment for what they say they stand for. And so we want that audio to match the video as much as possible. And again, this action of values-based leadership, it can be practiced at the organization level, it can be practiced at the team level, it can be practiced within our families and in our communities, because we don't believe that leadership ends at the front door. So Greg, you want to talk a little bit about development?
Sure. So much of what we do is about these 2 words, capacity and agility. And let me give you an analogy of using transportation. When we're born, we crawl, then we walk, then we learn to run. Most of us ride a bike. Many of us drive a car. Some of us even become pilots. So that'd be a capacity related to transportation. But the agility is, the pilot doesn't take the plane to the corner store. The pilot has the agility to say, I'm going to walk to the neighbors, take the bike to the park, drive across town, and fly to another country. So capacity for families means emotionally and strategically, can you show up in the right gear, the right mindset? So should I show up as a coach with this issue? Should I be in command and control? What's the agility needed to pivot to the most effective frame for this issue? So many people show up in the gear they're comfortable with, not the gear that's most effective. So simple concept, but a lifelong practice. Thanks, Tom.
So my organization, InnerWill, we're a nonprofit. We work with for-profit companies. We use that money to cover our costs, and that allows us to do reduced rate work for nonprofits, schools, universities, kind of for the public good. And we're actually a part of a larger family-held organization. We're the largest aggregate producer in the United States that's still family-held, called Luck Companies. And within our own family business, we practice these 5 different practices within the organization that allow us to create alignment between our employees, between our leaders, between the family and the larger enterprise itself. And then Interwill as an organization then takes this out to our clients. So the first practice is really about taking stock, which is about understanding and seeing yourself and the organization really clearly. There's no perfect organization. There are things that you can see about yourselves that are fantastic. There's things that you see about yourselves that are gaps. And our job as leaders is to work on that. So we want to assess what's working and what's not. We want to make sure we're getting feedback. We want to make sure that it's okay to point out what's great and okay to point out what's not. And then to be very thoughtful about how we use data to make decisions. The second practice is really about culture. And so have we clarified very specifically, what does it mean to have our vision and mission? What are our values? How do they support our overall organization strategy? And then are we using values to make business decisions every single day? The third practice is really about leadership. You know, one of the things that Greg and I have found is you cannot transform a culture, you cannot execute on a strategy, you cannot ensure tight alignment between the family and the enterprise without leading every single day. And sometimes that means making the hard choices. Sometimes that means inspiring people. Sometimes that means that we're developing our next generation. Sometimes it means we're really making sure our hypos are in place. And at the end of the day, it's also about accountability, especially for the senior most leaders. As we like to say, you know, when your name's on the wrapper, it's even more important that you model what you want in the culture. It can't be do as I say, not as I do. It has to be follow me. The third practice when it comes to values-based leadership is really about engaging everybody. So that's when we unlock the energy of our folks, of our employees at every level, when we engage our family and multiple generations and the ongoing sustainability of our private enterprises, and that we really provide a lot of inspiration. You know, when we're working with families who are wrapped around a business, oftentimes you'll hear things like, you know, the third generation doesn't get the fourth generation, or the second generation makes all the decisions and we're really left out. And so this practice is really about, at the appropriate level, making sure everybody has a voice, that they feel empowered to make choices, and that they're involved in our ongoing sustainability of this enterprise and the sustainability of our families. And then the final practice is really about alignment. So making sure we've got processes and practices and governance in place that really embody our values and help make them real. So you want to operationalize your values in a way that everybody within the family and everybody within the enterprise can take action on it. And that we're constantly working on our relationships to make sure that those relationships are going to help us move forward. You know, it's surprising that no matter what industry we're in, we're all in the people business, especially when it comes to family enterprise. And finally, a big part of this alignment is about celebrating our stories and celebrating our wins and really telling people stories that help and further the culture of our organizations.
You know, I have to sort of pivot for a second. So I met people at the Luck Company that created Interwill, that Tom's president of, probably 15 years ago. Tom and I co-taught the capstone class in the executive MBA at Stetson when I was director. But I became obsessed about a decade ago with finding a workplace of more than a few friends working together where people were engaged and happy. And I went up and spent 2 days at the Luck Company. And they have done this work for many years, over a decade. And it is a culture that is different. They gave me unfettered access to talk to anybody, ask anything, and walk around, just watch what was going on. And when you see a business that is dedicated to building this kind of capacity and agility, and the values are real and people are held to them and they're celebrated, it's a different experience. It is profound. But that's why I'm on the Interwill. I think what they do is transformative. Let me pivot back to the presentation here. 2 thoughts to keep in mind. I jokingly say, if you're thinking of getting a tattoo this weekend, these are 2 good candidates. So number 1 is the Gallup organization said the number 1 reason that people leave a job is a bad boss. I'm sure everybody's had a bad boss. So if you don't have a leadership practice, I would at least put that idea forward today. And then second, a wonderful quote that I'll probably get near right is, an organization's culture probably can't develop beyond the capacity of its leaders. To make that a little more concrete, I was working with two brothers who had just done a 360. And so we were going over it. We took a whiteboard, we wrote each of the brothers' three biggest strengths, and then each of the brothers' three biggest weaknesses. And I said, does this describe the culture here? And they went, my God, it does. So culture isn't some amorphous thing that sort of happens in the cloud. It is really, I think, defined by the family and especially the leader's character. So let's talk about the leadership model that Tom and I use. So it's based on studying 800 leaders and what they actually do. This was the sort of the backbone of the executive MBA program. So we're going to give you a semester's course in 4 slides. So please jump in if you have any questions or comments or confusion. So they said people develop these 4 key agilities of self-awareness, empathy, framing, and innovation. And they deepen them, and they also start to come together more in the moment. So I'll give you one quick example. I was working with a pretty evolved guy, and we were planning a workshop, and he looked at me and he said, Greg, something you just said triggered something in me. So self-awareness in the moment. Then he saw my reaction like, oh my God, did I do something? And he said, you did nothing wrong. This is baggage I have on this topic. So empathy. Framing, he said, I think if we can take 5 minutes and let me debrief on this, I can get my head back into the meeting. Now, a different person at a different stage of development could have handled that or processed that far less effectively. He didn't get to innovation in that session, although the workshop we were planning was pretty innovative. But you get a sense of how these 4 agilities start to play together. Self-awareness, I think we know, I'm sure, Paul, some of the work that comes into your group is, who are you? How do you show up? Are you emotionally intelligent? DISC, Myers-Briggs, getting feedback. You know, in families, there's a resistance to having difficult conversations. So many of my clients talk about living in a bubble. So how do you get outside of the bubble? Empathy. Now, I did an exercise Monday of this week with some colleagues, and they had to listen to the other person for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. And one of them said it was absolute hell not giving advice. But you know what, everybody who gets listened to said it's so wonderful to be heard for 4 minutes and not get advice. So part of the agility is, when is advice the right gear? When is it not? And men tend to overuse that gear. Certain personality types tend to overuse it. Framing. So I work with a peer group of about 24 people running some of the biggest family offices in the country, if not the world. And this is the one that these highly trained, you know, estate lawyers, tax experts, investment professionals say they have shifted their thinking, that a meeting well framed is a meeting half over. What is the essence of what we're talking about? What do the people in the room care about? You know, I'm coaching a woman who is the head of a $2 billion family office. And she said, I like to wing it in the meeting. And I said, how does that work? And she goes, not very well. So there's a great example of the comfortable gear isn't always the right. So we agreed she'd frame her meetings. And so she spends half an hour framing meetings that are not much longer than that. But she said they're brilliant. I had a meeting with my estate attorney and 2 other attorneys last Friday. I framed it. It was supposed to be an hour meeting. We were done in 20 minutes. And the attorney said, this is the best meeting I've had all month, because it was well framed. Innovation. How do you produce value from change? How do you produce value from change? You need white space. You need to think. Being frantically busy and stressed doesn't lead to innovation. I often think of Indiana Jones running ahead of that boulder. He was not innovating. If your day feels like that, I would challenge you. You know, of all 12 people I'm coaching, I'm sure Tom finds the same thing. Every one of them says white space for deep thinking is one of their 2 biggest priorities. Next slide, if you would, Tom.
Maybe, Greg, if I could pause here for a quick second.
Sure.
And so I'll put this in the chat really quickly, but I'd just like to give you a second to think about, if you had to say, just from a personal perspective, which of those 4 agilities is your greatest strength? So they were self-awareness, empathy, framing, and innovation. If you had to pick one of the 4 that's your greatest strength, what would you say it is? So I'll put it in a chat real quick. Let's see. And while I'm putting it in the chat, maybe Paul, if you would go first, what do you think? If you had to pick your greatest strength, what would you say it is?
Harsh. I'd probably say innovation, because we're a small team and actually we just make decisions and get on with it and make something happen. So the last 6 months for us we've been a bit of a roller coaster. We've cancelled loads of events, but we've taken loads of things online, and we're just trying to be responsive, and actually it doesn't always work. But yeah, I think innovation for us for me is probably the one thing I probably think about most.
Yeah, and Paul, if you had to pick something that you struggle with, what would it be?
If I'm being honest, probably empathy.
I felt misunderstood when we talked before.
Yeah, empathy, I think, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you're never quite sure what the other person's agenda is, or what's going on in their world when they're talking about something. There's always different perspectives. So I struggle sometimes to really read between the lines or gauge what's going on. And I think even more so now when I'm not seeing people face to face and touching hands, and not touching hands, but it's going to get even worse, but in a room with people, as opposed to, I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Paul. How about John Bruns? What do you think? What do you feel like your greatest strength is when it comes to those 4 agilities?
Empathy. I'm doing a lot of work on self-awareness right now, and empathy seems to have gotten me to here. I've been reasonably agile and I think innovative in moving over the last 10 years. So I think empathy is probably my strongest suit.
That's great. Thank you, John. And then let's see, let's grab somebody else. Is it Marie? How do I pronounce your first name?
It's Mary.
Mary. So Mary, what would you say your greatest strength is when it comes to those 4?
I struggled a bit between empathy and framing, because I think there is a degree of empathy needed in framing well. So I put framing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the ideas that you've hit on, is that these are interdependent, right? So they don't stand by themselves, but you need self-awareness to have empathy. You need some empathy to frame well. You need to be able to frame well to be innovative in your thinking. You know, if I was going to be self-reflective for a moment, because I'm constantly trying to raise my awareness, especially at home with my wife and kids. But framing is probably the one I struggle with the most, because it seems so clear to me and I rush ahead and I'm so busy going fast that I don't slow things down long enough to really pose the right question or frame things in a way that people can understand clearly, or put it in a way that's going to be compelling. So, all right. Thanks everybody for jumping in.
Greg, can I just ask one quick question? You mentioned white space and how there's a need for white space for deep thinking.
Yeah.
How do you find your clients create white space, find space that just to do that?
Great question. So, you know, one of the things that this leadership agility model that we're talking about found that the people in the top 5%, that rarefied air, they tended to do 3 things: a daily workout regime, which I think is sort of knots the mind, a daily reflective practice, often meditation, and then a creative practice outside of work. And so I think those are at least a good start. But it can be walking your dog. It can be, you know, time alone on the back porch. I think it's just uninterrupted time without technology, where you can ponder something, on something, brainstorm. But it is hard. I have one client, her administrative assistant basically locks her in the office library and takes her phone, because it's just hard. Another client I have said, when I feel frantically busy, I feel important, which I think is true in our culture. So it's saying leadership requires space to be more effective, not just more efficient. Now, a client I have said, it's so seductive to just get stuff done, but then you end up running the most efficient Blockbuster store left. You know, your job as a leader to say, what's the change and how do I get people to buy in, and how do I lead that change? How do I create a vision? Paul, one more comment on that. Some of the workshops Tom and I do are just on management, making the system work, leadership, changing the system. And the research shows that most organizations are overmanaged and underled. We did a workshop with 50 business owners a few years ago, and 47 of the 50 leaders said they were overmanaging and underleading. And I think it's a paradox, because we need more leadership, and yet I think it's so seductive to just keep the train running.
Greg, it kind of goes along with this idea of self-care, and as hard-nosed business people, it's really easy to dismiss that idea. But really, at the end of the day, it's about energy management. So making sure we have the energy that we need to perform well for our business or our enterprise or our families. And when we neglect that, when we don't have the energy we need, when we're feeling burned out, when we're feeling stressed out, when we're too overbooked, when we're doing too much, then we're not showing up well for our folks and we're not being as effective as we can be. If I'm going to make a mistake, it's when I'm tired. If I'm going to irritate a client, it's when I'm burned out. If I'm going to fail at home, like I walk in the door and, it looks like a hand grenade went off and then I overreact and, maybe say some things that my wife does not appreciate. That's when I'm most at risk. And so better for me to carve out some time, carve out some energy, carve out some space so that I can be at my best, right? That's giving them the higher service.
So how do you develop these? So I would quickly suggest, and we'll show you some resources again, get feedback. Get feedback. Every leadership program I know says good leaders give and get feedback. Lean into positive feedback. So Ken Blanchard, who's written 50 books on leadership, came to a lot of company and when asked what one piece of advice he would give, catch people doing something right, especially during COVID. The article that we're going to share based on a survey of 1,000 family businesses across the globe said more communication and lean into the positive, appreciate people. Everybody's tired, this ambient rest where everybody, positive feedback is a great thing. Empathy, listen to people, try that. Can you believe that? 4 minutes of listening and people feel wonderful. So develop the agility to not, I have a brother, he is a wonderful guy, but he advised me on tenure. So he's a banker. I've seen him advise pregnant women, and I'm certain he's never given birth. Develop other gears. Okay. Framing. Sit down and think, what's the essence of this? What's my part in the equation? And as the one participant said, part of framing is empathy. Real brief story in my family, we have a family council. We finally decided we wanted a head of a family council. My siblings framed it around expertise in family business, so I was the logical choice. I said, let's frame it around family dynamics. If I lead, all kind of stuff gets thrown into the family dynamics that would be unproductive. In a month, everybody agreed. We made more progress with that dynamic in the next 3 months than we've made in the past 3 years. Framing is sort of, if not everything, really important. And then change that white space. So Paul, I'll be a little bit proud. Since I read some of the literature on this 8 years ago, I work out virtually every day. I meditate virtually every day. And I have a creative practice outside of work, which was the struggle for me. I'd never thought of that. So I can't paint or dance or sing or anything. So my creative practice is gift giving. So I try to give 5 gifts a week, usually to kids. And what a wonderful hobby it's become, because people love getting gifts, especially for no reason. And it forced me to pay more attention to somebody. If Tom says, oh, I love this wine, but I never treat myself, that goes in my mind. It's been a wonderful practice. So again, it's like getting in shape. If Tom said, do you know what I do to get in shape? Once a year, we go listen to this expert talk about fitness. Tom doesn't have much of a fitness practice. What's your leadership practice? Next slide, Tom.
Greg, I was going to say, you keep sending gifts to my wife and I don't really understand why. So now it makes a lot more sense.
Okay, so the stages. So these 4 agilities, again, they start to come together in the moment. They start to be integrated. And as Tom said, they're so interdependent. So let me give you an example, a family employment policy. So I'm going to pick on Tom again. Let's assume he and I are brothers and we have 2 other siblings. Let's assume between the 4 siblings, we have 12 cousins. Okay, so if I'm an expert, so there's one stage before this, most of us get through that stage by the time we're out of school. At the expert of about 45% of us, it's really, really important that I'm right and I'm in charge. If you disagree with me, then typically I see you as wrong. I'm going to advocate for that. And that can be a great way to lead, but it's got certain limitations. I had a colleague at Stetson who actually said, I see people's tools to solve my problems. I don't know that anybody ever got out of bed and said, I can't wait to get to work to be a tool for my boss. So there's a low level of empathy typically at this level. Your identity is attached to being the guy, the hero, the person in charge. So if Tom calls and says, Greg, my daughter Fifi just got laid off. Can we hire her in the family business? If I'm an expert, I see this as a problem. I'm the guy that solves problems. I say, yes, have her come in tomorrow. Boom, highly efficient, done in 5 seconds, I hang up. Okay. Let's look at the next stage that people evolve to. And roughly a third of us have this as our home base, the achiever. So this is where I can step back from the problem a little bit. I see more the system, the strategy. I'm still the guy. I still want it to be my solution, but I'm willing to get input from Russ because he knows technology, from Paul because he knows marketing. So it's a shared vision, but it's my vision leading it. Okay? I'm more open to some feedback. Okay, these 4 agilities are starting to develop, probably not in the moment, but a day later, a couple days later. I'm reflecting, I'm thinking, maybe I'm reframing. So let's take the same hypothetical at this stage. I'm an achiever. Tom calls me and says, can you hire my daughter, Fifi? Well, I step back and I say, Tom, I could, but let's look at, we have 12 cousins. So if I hire her, we've got 11 more decisions to make. And we're setting a precedent here. Or a family employment policy. So what if we get me, you, and our 2 sisters together, and the 4 siblings write a family employment strategy or policy? Now, I can't do that on the phone. That's going to be less efficient, but I think most people would agree it's generally more effective because I see the system. Okay? So achievers tend to be loved by organizations. They tend to be strategic. They're good at getting buy-in, and they think a little broader. Let's look at where 5%, and again, there's 2 stages above this, but 5% of leaders get to. And there's a shift at this level. And I say this is why we used it in the MBA. This is why I use it with families, because this shift of no longer being attached to being the hero. It's a gear you can use. If you have to step up and say, I'm in charge, this is a crisis, here's what we need to do, you can do it. But you can also lean back and say, this is where I'm going to let Paul take the lead. This is where I'm going to let the team take the lead. Okay. So there's that shift in identity is profound. And so the catalyst can see the problem. Sometimes ordering lunch is just ordering lunch. They can see the system and strategy, but they are aware of culture. And Peter Drucker said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. So one of my mentors who runs Bush Beans, a pretty iconic family business here in the States, he was the chairman of Bush Brothers and took it from a regional cannery decades ago to one of the most innovative food companies in the world with beans. Yeah. He said his job was culture. Management did strategy, the board oversaw strategy. Okay. But let's reboot the example with Tom and assume I'm a catalyst for a moment. So Tom calls and says, can you hire Fifi? So I'm probably going to lean into more, tell me what happened. I know she has a child, and explore what's going on with the family. Then I might say, Tom, let's frame this that we have a chance here, not only to set a precedent and create a policy, but the cousins are all coming out of college. They've always gotten along well as family members, as compliant, loyal family members. But let's shift the culture of the rising generation. Let's get the cousins, all 12 of them, to work with somebody and have them come up with a recommended family employment policy or strategy. Let's put them not in the role of compliant kids, listening to their aunts and uncles and parents. Let's put them in the role of taking ownership for their decisions. We still get to approve it, but let's get them working as professionals. Let's evolve the culture of the rising generation. Now that's going to be far less efficient. There's no way, Tom, that may take up to a year. But I think you see it as a potential to be transforming. So the catalyst, getting people to the catalyst level is just wonderful. They tend to be great people to work with and for, and they tend to be visionary. And there are ways to accelerate your development here. So any questions or comments? Because that's a lot of information in a very short period.
So Russ, if you don't mind hopping on mic, what's your perspective so far based on what you've heard Greg and I share?
I think it's a fascinating insight. I'm particularly interested in terms of the previous slide and the catalyst element. That level of self-awareness is, when do people understand or appreciate and have the self-awareness that they're in that catalyst kind of zone? Are they inextricably linked, or how does that function?
What do you think,
Great
Greg?
question. You know, my sense, and again, working with the MBA students who would be 25 to 60 years of age, this was sort of the backbone of the whole 18 months. That one, just giving people this roadmap tends to accelerate their development. Showing them what the behavior would look like at the next level up. I find once people start to move beyond the expert stage, so there's a defensiveness there oftentimes. At the achiever level, there's usually this momentum, this openness to grow, this awareness that I'm getting feedback and everybody sees something about me and I don't, that's a risk. So I'd say from the achiever level up, there's a momentum. You know, it's interesting to get a little bit deeper. What do you think the culture of your family enterprise is? At what stage? And how would you evolve that? So I did a workshop with about 6 business owners 5 years ago. And they said, you know, our entire recruiting and compensation package rewards expert level behavior, not catalyst level. So it's a wonderful lens to look through. You know, Tom and I spend our lives on leadership. And generally, most people don't have a vision of what leadership is. You know, it's somebody who's a great orator. It's somebody who can take charge. It's somebody who doesn't take any guff. But usually it's summarized in a phrase. To me, this has been great because it's a roadmap. It's a practice. It's accessible. And it's a great way to show up better for your family. You know, as Tom said, one of the things we preached in the executive MBA is generally the personal and professional can't be separated. I mean, sometimes certainly they have to be, but who you are is who you are. How you show up at work is how you show up at home.
So, so Greg and I are both. Sorry, Greg.
Go ahead, Tom.
So Greg and I are both executive coaches, and I was working with a client yesterday who was a recovering lawyer and former general counsel, and you know, she was talking about, you know, in her career in the beginning, she was very much paid to be right and to be the expert and to be perfect in all things and to have a good argument. You know, and then as she began to manage more people and a partner in the firm, it became more about the strategy and where she was trying to take the organization and more about her development of young lawyers. And her ability to be right was less important, you know, and now that she's sort of on the other side of her career and she's a little bit lost because her identity was all tied up in being right and having control. And now she's like in a different spot. And so one of the things that you see as you progress through those stages is the need to be right and the need to control and the need to tell people what you think. It fades and fades and fades and fades, but it also means you've got to be really comfortable not having to be right all the time, you know, and to be okay with your identity being something different.
Tom, having said that, do you feel that in family firms where you've got a leader who's maybe coming to the end of their career, there's less of an acceptance of being able to not be right all the time, because they kind of almost put themselves on a stage as being the leader because they know everything, and they find it really difficult to let go and hand down? So do you see people changing where they sit in that model with age?
It's a really good point, Paul. You know, the successful leaders, as they're on the back end of their career, have done a good job with succession. They've done a good job developing the next generation. They've got people in line and ready to be able to hand the organization off to, and that they're able to transition into something with dignity and to feel good and proud of the work they've done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the flip side is those CEOs or those older generations who are just hanging on with a death grip, and they haven't developed their team and they haven't focused on succession, and they wake up one morning and they realize that they're not invulnerable and they're not going to live to be 250 years old, and they have this moment of panic. So I would definitely say the ones who have been thoughtful and intentional are probably higher on that achiever / catalyst model than the ones who are still busy trying to hang on to everything.
Okay, and then the second bit, which leads into your example with your coaching client yesterday with a lawyer, if you've got a next generation that have gone out to learn new skills and become accountants, lawyers, bankers, that are in that, they have to be right, they have to make decisions all the time, but come back into the culture of a family firm, how do you see that playing out, where they've then got to take on a totally different culture of an organization and part of the family and the role to do the right thing for the business?
Yeah. Without the self-awareness and the willingness to work on themselves, they're probably going to struggle.
Okay.
They're probably going to cause friction, and they're probably going to get stuck. And the organization, especially if they're in the senior most levels, is not going to be able to evolve past their level, right? Like we can only go as far as our senior leaders are kind of built and developed. And so it's incredibly important for those folks to be working on themselves, to be looking in the mirror, to be getting feedback, to be trying to evolve, to be very much focused on influence as opposed to being right and telling. So it's a pretty heavy lift when it comes to making that kind of transition. Greg, thoughts?
Yeah, that capacity and agility. So if you're a surgeon or the estate attorney, that gear that I'm here to know the right answer, sort of my expert mindset, that's a good gear, but it doesn't fit well as a leader. So helping the person at least understand, as a leader, you have to deal with ambiguity, you have to deal with vulnerability, you have to inspire people. So being right is at best one of 6 gears, so at least helping people see that, that's often, like Tom said, a lot of people we coach have had great success in the technical realm. But when you say, now you're in charge of the culture, that's overwhelming for them. It's so nebulous. So helping them understand that and what it means. And again, what's a daily practice? How could you show up differently? How could you empathize more?
It's interesting. One kind of final example is, so the head of our family business is a gentleman by the name of Charlie Luck. It's the Luck family. And so Charlie, he doesn't need to tell me how to run Inner Will. He's on our board. He gives me advice when I need it, but he doesn't need to be the expert all the time. Although the flip side is he has excellent taste, and when it comes to the way brands look and the way that colors look, and he's really got a value of aesthetics. And so it's really important that he gives me advice on what looks good and what doesn't look good. That's a perfect time for him to use that gear of expertise, because I have terrible taste. So Greg, why don't we flip back to the deck really quickly? Sorry about that.
So Tom, one comment on that slide, and then
please
we can move on. Yeah, so under stress, we can downshift. And again, think of the Russian nesting dolls. The catalyst doesn't walk around innovating at every discussion. Again, it's that agility to say, this is just a problem. This is something strategic. This is the culture, but they have that capacity. Again, like the pilot doesn't fly everywhere.
Yeah, Greg, so would you say that lately with COVID and everything else that's going on in the world, we're seeing a lot more of that downshifting?
Yes. This ambient stress, I think, gets everybody a little bit, probably shifting down a gear at least occasionally. So some compassion, you'll see that in the survey article that we're going to send out, some understanding, we're all a little bit wonky. And so empathy is really important. So just some of the research, there's no way to skip stages. There's no magic pill to go from an expert to a catalyst or above. You retain the capacities, so you don't lose them. You can still walk, crawl, run, and ride a bike, so to speak. You tend to have a home base throughout the day, as we mentioned, downshift. At one point in my career was running 2 programs in my firm, and I was showing up with the administrative assistants at the expert level because I had no time, and all I want to do was have them book a flight, order lunch, and that was not intentional, but it showed me how time pressure can push us all down a gear. And that agility, there's a great scene in a movie with Paul Newman from a long time ago where he was a criminal, and they arrest him and they say, how did you think this up? And he goes, well, I just imagined the guy smarter than me and thought about what he would do. And I can tell you with Tom, with the woman in my office, Audra, probably once a week, I say, what would somebody at a higher stage do? And it's a wonderful thought experiment. Because, you can get triggered, you can get into advocating your point of view, you can get attached to, I know I'm right here. and you say, okay, what's he at least thinking? Okay, how could I maybe find some higher level of solution here? So again, I love that this is a path and a practice. This isn't just some great slogans. In the MBA, we had two mantras. What gear should I be in? And the other one was, how do I get comfortable being uncomfortable? Because to return to that analogy of working out, if I saw Paul coming out of the gym and said, Paul, how was your workout? And he said, you know, it was great. I didn't stretch or sweat at all. That's not a workout, right? So a group I'm working with, one person, you know, they were invited to join a leadership team. Of 8, he was the only one that said, I have to be honest, this is too hard. I don't want to do it, which I thought was pretty self-aware. He was comfortable being an expert. He didn't want to get into the people, the vulnerability side, the, you know, all the things that we've talked about. It is hard, but it is also transformative for your family, yourself, and your business. Next slide, Tom.
So Paul was gracious enough to allow us to ask you some questions ahead of our webinar today. And so in your feedback to us about what you were dealing with and what you were grappling with and what you had questions about, there were really kind of 4 big buckets that people identified on this call that were really important to them. Number 1, dealing with uncertainty. Number 2, communication. Number 3, being able to make decisions. And then number 4, kind of your shifting strategy. So we'd love to just kind of open up the floor and have a conversation about kind of what you're most passionate about, what you're wrestling with, what questions you might have. This is a great chance to hear not just from us, but also from your fellow participants as well. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And if you would, go back into naming your screen and rename whatever you want us to call you.
Can I start with a question, actually, Tom?
Sure, please.
And it's a question that's come up 2 or 3 times with next generation members in the last couple of weeks, where the next gen's working in the business and their parents are in a business that is now fighting for survival. And the next gen has got skills that they can use to help in terms of digital and take it forward, but they're struggling with knowing how to bring up those conversations, but they're also struggling with seeing their parents struggle and not communicate, and trying to break through a conversational level with a family that's just having a difficult time. How would you suggest they can add influence and voice to the conversation? What would you suggest for them to do in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to hear, you know, everybody on this call has probably dealt with the same thing at one time or another. You know, I think when it comes to the younger generations and trying to address older generations, part of it's they've got kind of long-term dynamics from how they grew up and how the family runs and sort of all those family dynamics that they're navigating. But at the end of the day, one of the things that they can trust is that most people are committed to keeping the family together. And so because of that shared commitment, then that gives them the opportunity to push boundaries and be a little uncomfortable and have a tough conversation. And they have to do it with some skill. But really, it's more about courage and confidence and faith that the family's going to hang together, more so than it is having the exact right words or the exact right questions or the exact right time. It's always going to be messy, especially if you've never had these kind of frank discussions. They're absolutely required right now. So folks on the call, any other advice kind of in that particular situation about what you
I was just going to add that, I was just going to add that you need a good facilitator. Like, that's the role that I often play in our family. I'm the one that brings people together when they're having an argument, or speaks to both sides, puts the other person's perspective across. And I think every business should have that person that can do that. Maybe I'm not saying I'm perfect, but in that respect, what I'm good at is quite useful.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Hannah. Anybody else?
I agree with Hannah 100%. And if the younger generation, those individuals, they know somebody that the parents know that is a trusted person within the family, that person that they can actually word up and talk about their feelings before they sit down to meet with the parents, talk about their fears, about what they're worried about if they say the wrong thing, so that that individual can support them while they're sitting in the room together. And also, because they're a trusted person with the parents, then the parents can actually look to this person and say, what are we coming to here? Why are they coming to us like this? And how are we supposed to respond? Do we need time to think about it and process this? And it's a really big challenge for younger generation people to make these, have these conversations. It's a constant. You know, here in Perth, there are things that I've got a forum group of a group of young people, and we have these conversations amongst ourselves. So we have a little group where we can talk about the planning of the next steps for these younger generation people to talk to their parents. So even if you can get 5 or 10 young people that are happy to get together and talk through their issues, they can support each other through the process as well. And somehow they even get to be able to work with the parents in these cases. The groups can come together. They know somebody who knows somebody that can be a support through the process and the conversation.
That's great. So Hannah and John had better answers than I did, clearly. You know, just kind of one final comment is I'm the product of several failed family businesses. So my grandfather was an entrepreneur, and he started, you know, more businesses than you can count on both hands. And he bankrupted every last one of them. And so those businesses really didn't survive him. But the legacy of his dynamics with his wife, my grandmother, with my dad and his siblings, those still live on. He's left quite the family legacy that we're still kind of working through. So I think it's incredibly important that as we're thinking about the next generation following us, that we're allowing that back and forth dialogue, that feedback, those hard conversations to happen, and we're encouraging them and nurturing them and really modeling what it looks like so that we're equipping that next generation to have the skills that they need to talk to us and be truth tellers to us. But again, that takes a lot of maturity on our part and self-work on us to allow that to happen. So,
yeah, 2 points if I could, Tom, and building on especially what Hannah said, but also John. I think the research and our experience shows the ability for the family to have the difficult conversation is the most important thing. And research bears this out, our experience bears this out. So how do you make that safe? Maybe it's with a facilitator, maybe with a coach, maybe using Paul's resources. But if you're avoiding that bump under the carpet, you're going to keep tripping up over it. So the number one is that. The other one, and Tom has a great line, we're all professional boss watchers. Mm-hmm. So when families say we don't want to tell the employees and stress them out, you know, my dad has a wonderful saying, silence when people expect communication will always be interpreted negatively. So the employees are wondering and looking and speculating. It's always better to tell them something than tell them nothing. So this notion we're keeping a secret is, I've never seen that be a wise decision.
So I'd love to hear from maybe Adam or Grant. Any perspective on some of the things that we've been talking about today, or any particular issues that you guys are grappling with within your own family enterprise?
Yeah, I had a question for you actually, Tom. Greg. I'm a lawyer actually who advises family businesses. So I was empathizing with your story about your client yesterday.
Yeah,
very much so. But actually, one of the key words I wrote down and then put a circle around was something Greg said, and it was the word momentum. So as an advisor, it can be sort of the huge effort to get in front of the family, huge effort to do some of the things that you've literally just been talking about, encouraging the intergenerational conversations and so on. Then you kind of go away. How do you make sure the family businesses are keeping the momentum? And really, I'm referring there to so that it's not just that, let's say, a 3 to 4 month exercise, you're fixed for life, and then you meet them again in a year, and it's all sort of reverted. Do you guys have sort of ongoing programs that you keep people sort of on their toes, if that's not too sort of intrusive a statement to use, but you know, to keep that momentum going after all this effort of getting over these hurdles, those bumps in the carpet, and not let it all revert? Any top tips on that?
What do you think, Greg?
Well, so Adam, I'd say, hey, it's incredibly hard. It's like, you know, it's easier to stay in shape than get in shape, but inevitably life gets busy and this is seldom a priority and so on. I would say that the best families we've worked with, you know, sort of invest heavy at the front end and then bring us in once or twice a year or 4 times a year to keep the momentum going. Mm-hmm. I'd say something I've learned, and I think this is human nature, though not my nature, is families love numbers. So some of the work we do, like the leadership agility, or there's a team building thing. So the assessment that gives them scores somehow makes it exciting and wonderful so that they can see we've up a stage, or our team score and trust went up 0.5. Somehow that makes this qualitative, nebulous cultural stuff real. So it's astounding how important that is to families, that our score went up 0.5. We don't know what that means, but we're really happy about it. So quantifying stuff seems to be a help. But Tom, anything you'd add?
But
Yeah,
it seems
maybe-
to me,
maybe-
before Tom mentioned, it seems to me then that we ourselves have to be the innovators in how we keep that going alongside them. And if you'd asked, if I jumped in before, that innovation is the one agility I would have said I would most struggle with as an attorney, which is an obvious shortcoming.
Tom,
That's great, Adam. I really appreciate that. You know, so to your point, I mean, part of it's how, when we are framing up these engagements, you know, painting that picture that it's not one and done, you know?
Yeah.
And if you've got a client who thinks that they're going to solve all their issues in an afternoon for 3 hours, and then, you know, they're all squared away as a family, it just doesn't work that way. Now, the trick is, for people like Greg and I, how do we paint a picture of how the real process is going to work over time in a way that isn't so scary that people bail out? Because it's a lifetime's worth of work. It's a long journey, you know, to keep families healthy and keep enterprises healthy.
I think I agree with you. So once we've been through a process, it's hard to then say, and I'll be back in 6 months' time to do it again. And that scary is the right word that you've just used.
Yeah. You know, this is applies to Greg and I a little more than maybe your role, Adam, is that, you know, we very much try and teach people to fish. And so if they can think of these practices that we're teaching them as ongoing practices that they engage in, then they should be able to do some of that work on their own, whether we're in the room or not. Now we want them we want to be in the room with them, and, you know, we care about our revenue as well. But at the same time, we really do our work for impact. We want them to be better people and stronger families on the other side of it.
Adam, if I can circle back, so on innovation, so the work that Tom and I do, and probably a big part of the work you do, I think it's innovative in that families often don't know what a family business consultant is. You know, they think we're going to write some long report that says Ralph should be the next president versus the process work. So most families don't have a sophistication about the work we do, so we have to define it. I think it tends to be qualitative work, greater trust, greater communication. You know, the tax guy can say, I saved you 80,000 pounds, here's the number. Our work generally is preventative. So it's a little bit like saying, you know, Hannah, what would you pay not to have a heart attack? Well, maybe not much, unless my chest started to tighten up, then I'd probably pay more. So I think there's an art to what Tom and I do, and I have worked a lot on this and would like to get better. But helping the client see, I think of one family we worked with, it was 4 brothers. They had not dealt with the ownership succession for 12 years. Some trust issues, some communication issues. We did some really heavy lifting on the trust. They got the buy-sell done. But the one brother said, why did we have to spend that weekend on trust? So helping the family see the value of the work, that you develop the capacity to have this difficult conversation. So you got unstuck with your brother on, could non-family members own stock, and, you know, and so on. So you never looking self-promoting, hopefully, but also seeing, because you went to the gym and sweated and lifted and did all that stuff, that's why you were able to run the marathon with your granddaughter, kind of metaphor. But I find families don't have the patience oftentimes to realize the value of the work, and we have to help them see it.
Agree with that.
Grant,
with apologies, thanks ever so much for your feedback on my question. I do have to jump off and get on at 3 o'clock. So great to see you. Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
So Grant, love to hear from you.
No, there's lots and lots of interesting stuff there. I think, yeah, it's difficult on the agilities one. I think there's the self-awareness I find is probably what I would say my greatest strength, but it could also be perceived as a weakness, because you can almost be too self-aware and then self-awareness becomes self-doubt. And I think I probably struggle with that and also in that, in terms of that, if you're not a confrontational person, and you're talking about agilities and switching almost between management styles, if you're not confident enough in people's belief in your abilities or your decisions, then you can second guess or avoid confrontation. So it's a strength and a weakness in a way, I find, and that's yeah, it links definitely to the empathy, but then you can overthink how the other person's going to interpret what you're saying. And so yeah, no, I thought that was particularly relevant. I mean, in terms of my business or my family business, it's about, I suppose, at this difficult time that so many businesses are facing, and there's that dichotomy between family and business and where the two marry. And I think Greg mentioned it earlier about difficult decisions have to be made. And if you've painted yourself as a family business, a caring business, or more caring than your average business because you have family values, and then you have to make redundancies and tough decisions, and then the internal comms to your team, and Greg mentioned it as well, it's better to say something than nothing. But if what you've got to say is quite negative, or could be construed as negative, yeah, grappling with that, I suppose, is probably the most pertinent thing to me in this current crisis. Not that we've made huge redundancies, but obviously we've had to make cuts because incomes are down in our personal circumstances. We're unfortunately not an alcohol or tobacco or whatever the other three industries that are booming.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the great parts about being a part of a family business is that connection that you have, hopefully. One of the downsides of being a part of a family business is that connection. And that when we say goodbye to people, it's hard, especially if they're really dedicated and have been loyal and have been great performers, and that we're just having to make cuts or reductions or what have you. You know, I think one of the secrets, or one of the things that family members really need in those cases, is to be really transparent and vulnerable, and being willing to admit that this is hard, and being willing to admit that our family has really grappled and wrestled with this. And that if you have the right relationships and trust throughout the organization, that vulnerability will mean a lot to your folks, and it means a lot to the people that you're saying goodbye to as well.
Yeah, I think that comes across. I suppose the other element is that in terms of day-to-day management of the company, there is only 2 family members that are hands-on, and therefore you have a board of, say, 8, and 2 of us are family, and that's grown as the company, we're now over kind of 100 people, say. Still purporting to be a family business feels slightly disingenuous almost, because there's, as you were mentioning before, there's non-family shareholders, and the lion's share of the work is being done by people that don't have our surname. So it's kind of, again, that feels something that I contemplate quite a lot, I suppose, when I'm discussing being a family business.
You know, Grant, if I can just plant the seed, one of the questions Tom and I use when we work with families, and it can take a year to truly answer this, is 2 questions. Tell me how the business benefits from having your family involved, and then tell me how your family benefits by being connected to this business. And then we've had some really wonderful clients where after the family reaches consensus on that, we ask the board of directors those 2 questions, and then we ask management, and then we have a discussion. So again, you know, one of the slides said, how do you make your family a strategic advantage? That should be, I think, a wonderful goal. That, are we developing greater trust? Are we developing values-based leadership? Are we developing an impact on the community? You know, why are we doing this? An exercise Tom and I use is saying to the family, not the business, but the family. Imagine your family was on the cover of a magazine 5 years from now. What would the magazine be? And what would the caption under your family be? And so wonderful, what's our purpose? Why are we doing this? And if you're not aligned on that, you know, I think there's some opportunity there.
Awesome. So Russ and Bretta, love to hear from either of you. Any perspective, questions, thoughts?
To come back to one of the previous questions and offering an opinion on that, around how do you continue to ensure that change is driven within a business when our own intervention sort of moves away. I know Joshua Nax has done a lot of work on sort of the family champion, and having somebody within the family who takes on that responsibility to ensure that it is the focus is maintained on it, rather than necessarily having to do the work, but focusing that everybody is doing their bit can help. And I think, again, echoing your point that you made around families doing the work, or it may have been Greg, sorry, it's a bit like a personal trainer. They can design the program, but only the individuals can do the work to see the results. Mm-hmm. And I think as well, that's where it can take a little bit longer to perhaps have that impact, is that it can be hard work. It can be really hard work to get this stuff done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Hannah, would you say that your role in your family, is it that role of family champion, or is it more of the facilitator, or more of the person that everybody trusts, so you're sort of the go-to?
Definitely a facilitator, and I'm always kind of wanting to move us forward. But the role I have, because I look after comms and HR, my teams aren't. I run 2 garden centres, so then my teams are not the ones actually doing the work, if that makes sense. They're kind of supporting roles. So my biggest challenge is I want to move us forward. I've got ideas. I love learning. That's why I come on webinars and things. I want fresh ideas, but then I've got to take it back and persuade people and bring them on that journey with me. And that's where I fall down sometimes. is making it happen and framing it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. John, any additional perspective?
Look, I've got a number of client families at the moment, and it's very easy to see the archetypes that are on that slide. I can just see those pictures, and I can almost see the faces of the people in the family and where they sit. And it's probably the clearest slide that I've ever seen depicting that. So thank you for that. Yeah, I've enjoyed the presentation. I'll leave it there. I don't want to take too much. It's been, I've had a day of Zooms. So for me, it's 10 o'clock at night, and I've had about 5 hours of Zoom today. So
we don't take it personally, John. Thank you. So Paul, any other questions or thoughts as we begin to wind down?
Well, I think for me, it's kind of clarified some of the different roles and the engagement of families. I think the only other layer I think adds more complexity to the whole conversation is that actually creating a new, and Greg, I think you mentioned it, engaged workplaces, because it's fine talking about this from a family perspective and the family members developing that strategic thought process so you understand where you're coming from and moving it forward. But a lot of families, and Grant alluded to this, are bringing in non-family directors and management. So it's actually taking them on the same journey. And it's how you almost create that changing environment so that people can actually make a difference and are empowered to contribute and get their voice out there, to work together. So it's not family versus the management team. Actually, you're on the same page working it forward, and how you have those joint conversations.
It's the end of my day, not the end of your day, Paul.
You'd be surprised.
So just to maybe leave you with just a couple of final thoughts.
This wasn't planned, by the way, so if you have got something up your sleeve, I didn't know about it.
So, just some takeaways from our conversation today. This family enterprise mindset is just incredibly important, especially Greg's point about seeing the family as a strategic competitive advantage for the business, and then seeing the advantages that the business brings to the family and really nurturing that over time. And the second idea is creating alignment. And everybody on this call felt very strongly aligned, so we didn't end up spending a lot of time on it. But having a sense of we're clear on our mission and vision, we're clear on our strategy, we're clear on the values required to execute on that strategy, and we've got the leadership and processes to underpin all of it. And we're very intentional about making sure that we're using our values as a way of creating momentum and creating alignment around decisions, relationships, etc. And then our final takeaway is really working on ourselves. And we spent a lot of time talking about how to build our own capacity and agility going forward. So Greg, any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to everybody?
Yeah, I think there's so much at stake when you put your family and business together. A colleague of ours said any wimp can get along with their family for 2 days at the holidays. It takes real courage to do what family businesses do. And Tom knows I taught hungover 18-year-olds at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I've had to learn to simplify things. So I think if most of us and most of our families care about two things: how do we help people achieve their potential, right? That's a big, big part of life. And how do we lessen unnecessary suffering? I think this model, and there are other models, but if you don't have a practice to develop yourself as a leader in your family, then I think you're leaving some of that potential and not lessening some of the unnecessary suffering. So if your family's a long-term vehicle, you all care about one another, I think a family enterprise is the perfect place to develop this kind of practice, because why not?
And my sort of final thought would be, right now, a lot of us are going through challenging times. We're dealing with this omni crisis. A lot of things are going badly at once. And a lot of our enterprises are struggling to figure out what's next. One thing I can say is that we'll get through it. These crises provide us an opportunity to discover who we want to be in the future and act towards it. And it has a way of unfreezing things in our culture and unfreezing things in our family, that if we look for the upside, we can find it. The other piece is that during these times, it's just incredibly important that we keep in mind sort of this higher purpose, that our role in family enterprise is to make a positive difference in the lives of other people, whether it's our family members or whether it's our employees. And then if we can focus on that every single day, that we're going to leave people better than we found them, and we're going to make a difference. So with that said, we're going to wrap things up. If you want to talk more, please reach out to Greg and I. We've got our contact information here, and Paul will have it. I believe we've been recording this, so we'll have a posting of the recording. Paul, any other news for the group before we break?
No, other than to say, Tom, Greg, thank you so much for your time. Really good insight into a topic that's challenging for lots of families, and I think it's been brought to the fore through the whole coronavirus pandemic, and it's made families come together and think about where they're going and what they want to do. So shared value, vision, and purpose is really important, and actually creating the leaders of tomorrow too is equally important. So I think you've both given us a shared collective on things to think about and take away. We'll be sharing all the details afterwards. I'll share the article that you posted to the chat too through the FBU platform later. But Greg, Tom, I know it's a busy time for you at the moment. Greg, enjoy all your dinners and dining out in Florida. Tom, keep safe where you're on the journey home. But you've been brilliant this afternoon. Thank you very much for your support and supporting the summit, and keep safe and well. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Take care.
Much appreciated.